Well, hello and welcome to Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is going to be divided into 3 segments. This first segment will be discussing the themes of biology, and then we'll continue with the rest of Chapter 1 in the other segments. So I'll introduce that once we get to that point. Biology is the study of life. All living things have the following 7 properties. Well, this image shows a graphic representing the 7 properties of life. So the 7 properties of life include reproduction, response to the environment, growth and development, energy processing, order, evolutionary adaptation. There are many levels of biological organization. We're going to go through those. Let's start with the most specific. So this would be, here we've got molecules, right? So we've got this molecule, and molecules are made up of atoms, and atoms are made up of subatomic particles. So if we went below the level of molecules, we could go next below, which would be atoms. And then it would be subatomic particles. But going up above molecules, we've got these molecules, which are made up of atoms and subatomic particles. Well, the molecules make up structures inside the cell. Okay, so this represents a chloroplast right here. The chloroplast is made up of molecules. And some of these molecules build into subcellular structures called organelles. Now, this is an organelle right here. Okay, an example of an organelle would be the chloroplast. Now, the chloroplast is going to be contained inside the cell. Okay, so cell, again, is the smallest unit of living things. So it's the cell that contains those 7 properties of life. Organelles don't have the 7 properties of life. Molecules don't consist of the 7 properties of life. It's the cells. And then everything above that level to some degree. Now, cells connect together to create tissues. Tissues are basically collections of cells that are connected together and they kind of interact with one another. Tissues make up organs. Okay, so organs like your heart is made up of heart tissue, which is made up of heart cells. Organs can build organ systems. Now, this isn't shown here, but organ systems can be basically a collection of organs that work together. An organ system might be, let's say, your nervous system. Your nervous system includes a bunch of organs like your brain and your spinal cord and your nerves. And all of these organs are made up of tissues, like your nervous tissue, and then made up of nervous cells, and then so on and so forth if you went below that. Now, going up above organs, of course, organisms are made up of organs, especially if we're talking about multicellular organisms like humans or like plants, we can see right here. Now, populations include a collection of organisms that belong to the same species. So here we can see a population of this particular flowering plant. Now, going up above this level, we have communities. Communities include all living things within a specific area. Okay, so look, we've got living things, but they don't have to belong to the same species, but it's living things. Look, we've got grasses, we've got flowering plants, we even have animals here and tall trees. Okay, this is a community of living things that may not belong to the same species. Now, if it's a group of living things that belong to the same species, it's called a population. Now, an ecosystem includes a community, which can include many organisms that belong to different species, but the ecosystem also includes non-living things, but it's a specific area. So it could be, let's say, a coral reef. A coral reef would include coral, and then it's got the ocean, of course, the salt water, right? Here we have mountains, and we have the ground. It's not living. Those are not living things. So ecosystems will also include non-living things. And then biosphere would be the largest where the living things exist. Of course, we don't know if there are aliens, right? So there may be living things that exist outside of our biosphere. We just haven't identified them yet, if they even exist. Okay, so those are the levels of biological organization or biological hierarchy. So we just went over the different levels of hierarchy of life. Well, living things have what's called emergent properties. Remember, living things are made up of many different things that come together to create a functional organism, really. So emergent properties, they result from the arrangement of all of these different things or parts within a system. And we could call a system a living organism. For instance, a human being like you. So emergent properties do not only apply to living things. It could apply to those things that are non-living, like a bicycle. So each of these parts of a bicycle, they each have their own function and structure. You could see they all are shaped differently in different sizes. However, them alone or just collectively put wherever randomly placed in a position do not provide emergent properties. They need to be put together in the correct orientation and the correct location for them to produce a functional product, in this case, the bicycle. So this bicycle has the emergent properties, which are the result from the arrangement of these parts, right? So all the bicycle parts, which were put in their correct places to create the functional bicycle. Now, this is obviously a non-living thing, but of course it applies. There are different ways in which a scientist will explore emergent properties. Now, there's two, I guess, schools of thought. There's the reductionist thought and the systematics thought. So we have the reductionist thought, which is basically analysis of the individual compartments within a system. So here, let's just talk about the cell. So we saw the cell, and we saw that the cell is made up of organelles, and the organelles are made up of molecules. So the reductionist is going to look at or analyze the molecules or a specific molecule within the cell. Systematics is the analysis of basically the interactions between the components within a biological system. So let's say the reductionist view is going to look at a particular molecule, let's say the molecule glucose or starch inside a cell. Well, the systematist is going to look at this starch or the glucose interaction with the other components within the system. Now, to explore emergent properties, both of these views must be, or schools of thought must be meshed together. So, to explore emergent properties, biologists or scientists in general are going to complement the reductionism and the systems biology. So the structure of parts and their function are linked together in some way. So at each level of the biological hierarchy, as we mentioned, remember the hierarchy involves atoms, we have molecules, we have macromolecules or organelles, and then organs and organ systems within a larger multicellular organism, you're going to find a correlation at every level between structure and function. So an example at a more macro level, like a species, we have a hummingbird here. So the hummingbird has a very long beak, and its wings can actually span beyond its body in the opposite direction. So it can get very close, and this allows it to be able to feed and go deep into those flowers in which maybe another type of bird without a long beak or without the ability to extend its wings beyond its body would not be able to get close enough to be able to feed off of that flower. Okay, so this is more at a macro level, but we're going to look at these things at a more micro level. So at the different molecules. So each molecule has a specific structure which gives it its function. So we're going to see many examples of that as we go through this. Cell is the smallest unit of life. Cells can be single cellular or multicellular. The cells of bacteria and archaea are called prokaryotic. All other forms of life have eukaryotic cells. So I touched on this a little bit ago. For a cell to perform all of the functions in which it is meant to, there must be some sort of instructions or direction, right? So inside a cell, there are instructions, and they're actually stored in chromosomes. So the instructions are stored in chromosomes, and the chromosomes are basically the genetic material. And the genetic material is going to be DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, but it is also made of protein. As I just mentioned, DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, is considered the genetic material. The DNA is going to make up the chromosomes, and the chromosomes are actually made up of a DNA molecule plus proteins. But within the DNA molecule, there are many, many genes, hundreds of thousands of genes. The genes are actually the units of inheritance, so basically genes are going to be passed down from one generation to the next. Now, you as an organism are a combination of genes from your mom and from your dad. So what happens during development is first the egg and sperm are going to fuse, and then they're going to create a fertilized egg. This fertilized egg is going to start to undergo cell divisions, creating a ball of cells. And then eventually these cells, at this point, these cells are identical in terms of the type of cell that they are, but then they start to differentiate into different cell types. Now they're going to contain the same DNA, same chromosomes, or combination of chromosomes resulting from this fusion of egg and sperm. However, the expression of certain genes will change within the different cell types. This is called differentiation. And the cell types are going to eventually differentiate. So the cells are going to differentiate into different cell types, which will create these different tissues, and then different organs and organ systems. And then, of course, part of development is putting these systems in the correct place. within the organism. And now we have a not a fully developed organism, but it is a full functional organism, an infant. And of course, this doesn't represent the entire life cycle of a human. However, this kind of shows what's involved in development. Now you can see these arrows right here. There's multiple arrows. There's a lot of steps going on in between there. But it kind of gives you a good overview. So, as I already mentioned, the DNA is going to provide the instructions. And here we're calling it a blueprint, really. So it kind of gives you the design. It's the design in which, of course, and we're going to talk about in terms of the production of a protein. So in the DNA, there's a sequence. It's a sequence of nucleotides. So the nucleotides are individual components that make up a long strand of deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. This is going to provide the specific, I guess it's a secret code, which will be designed to make in this case, a particular protein. And we're going to talk about crystallin. Okay, so crystallin is a protein which is transparent, and it makes up the lenses of the eye. Right, so we can see the lens of the eye, and looking a little bit closer at it using an electron microscope, we can see the individual cells that make up the lens. Okay, these individual cells are going to be composed of, it's not an individual cell, right? So they're going to be composed of crystallin, which is made up of protein. Now, how this protein is made, there are several different steps. So that's referred to as gene expression. So that's basically the expression of a particular gene or the production of the gene. Now, moving on to energy. Now, life or living things require energy to do anything, to really survive. And different living things depend on others for this energy. Now, plants, they can use light energy. They use light energy, the energy from light, to produce their own, let's say, sugars. They can produce their own food. So they can convert light energy into chemical energy. Organisms eat plants. So they take that chemical energy and they break that chemical, they extract the energy from those chemicals in order to do work. Work, an example would be me sitting here talking to you, or going for a run, or just walking somewhere, or just thinking. Your cells are doing work by doing that. Now, when organisms use chemical energy, use this energy to do work, generally heat is lost, right? So that's just another form of energy, right? It's not really lost. It's just converted from chemical energy to heat. Now we have a couple different types of organisms. Like I mentioned, plants can make their own food. They are producers. And then we have consumers like animals. Animals eat those foods from the producer, so they eat other organisms. Some of them can return the chemicals to the soil, so they can kind of break down dead organic matter, like some fungi and some bacteria. These are called decomposers. Now, in terms of the interaction between the components of a system, remember we talked about that bicycle. And of course, this applies to living things like a cell. The parts all must be present. And the interaction between these components allow the organism to be controlled or control the events that occur inside, let's say, the cell. So the cell can self-regulate through a process called feedback. It's called feedback regulation. So it's the ability to control processes by detecting things that it may need or not need. So there is a negative feedback and positive feedback. So negative feedback would be the inhibition or stopping of a process because it's not needed anymore. Positive feedback would be the activation of a process because it is needed. Now let's look at an example. So this example is going to show the interaction between organs and molecules. So we have what can happen is molecules that are from or originate from one organ can regulate or control the action of molecules from another organ. So let's look at this example in terms of insulin and blood glucose. So when your glucose concentrations are very high in the blood, this is going to stimulate the pancreas to release this protein or hormone called insulin. Insulin is going to be released, and then it's going to enter into the blood system with the glucose, and it's going to cause the insulin, basically the insulin is going to bind to cells, liver cells really, and it's going to make the liver cells take up some of that excess glucose that's in your blood. And eventually the liver cells are going to store the glucose as glycogen. Okay, so it's going to be stored. This ultimately is going to lower the blood glucose. And lowered blood glucose is not going to stimulate insulin secretion. So basically this is a negative feedback loop. So when blood glucose is low, it's going to stop the release of insulin. We'll see some other examples of positive and negative feedback. So moving up to a more broad level, the ecosystem level. At the ecosystem level, each organism is going to interact with other organisms. So here we have can interact with the living things, right? So we already know that plants absorb sunlight, right? So they take in this energy from sunlight and they can convert it to chemical energy. Eventually, these chemical energy is stored in leaves of plants. Those can fall to the ground. They can be decomposed by those organisms that are considered decomposers, returning water and minerals to the soil. Organisms can eat the plants, right? So they eat the plants and convert this chemical energy to work, right? To ATP is an example. And during this process, respiration occurs. During this process, organisms can take in oxygen and then or animals can take in oxygen and of course release carbon dioxide, and plants during the process of photosynthesis can take in the carbon dioxide and release oxygen in the atmosphere. So really those organisms that require oxygen are somewhat dependent on plants and other organisms that can photosynthesize. All right. So in summary, I spoke about the unifying themes of biology, really discussed what biology was, the scope of biology in general, the hierarchy of life, and the seven properties of life, and these unifying themes that kind of include all of it. So what we did discuss this time at this point was the organization, the information, energy and matter, and interactions. Evolution is going to be covered in the next segment. All right, until next time, bye bye.